All organisms carry genetic information in their DNA passed on from earlier generations. A wide range of organisms share a number of genes and show important homologies that can be used to determine evolutionary relationships. For example, all eukaryotic cells have mitochondria, and all mitochondria have their own genes. Because all genes mutate over time, shared genes contain differences that can be treated as derived characters in cladistic analysis. For that reason, similarities and differences in DNA can be used to develop hypotheses about evolutionary relationships. In general, the more derived genetic characters two species share, the more recently they shared a common ancestor, and the more closely they are related in evolutionary terms. If a gene mutates and is passed along to offspring, how are those offspring different from other offspring within the species? Well, the offspring with a mutated DNA will have a different genetic makeup than other offspring within the species. The mutated form of the gene may be passed to each generation thereafter. DNA analysis can be used to determine whether a species is more closely related to one ancestor than to another by comparing the different forms of genes present in each species. New techniques suggest new trees. The use of DNA characters in cladistic analysis has helped to make evolutionary trees more accurate. Consider, for example, the bird shown. The hooded vulture from Africa looks a lot like the American vulture. Both were traditionally classified in the falcid clade. But American vultures have a peculiar behavior. When they get overheated, they urinate on their legs, relying on evaporation to cool them down. Storks share this behavior, while hooded vultures and other vultures from Africa do not. Could the behavior be a clue to the real relationships between these birds? Biologists solved this puzzle by analyzing DNA from all three species. Molecular analysis showed that the DNA from American vultures is more similar to the DNA of storks than to the DNA of African vultures. DNA evidence therefore suggests that American vultures and storks share a more recent common ancestor than the American and African vultures do. Molecular analysis is a powerful tool that is now routinely used by taxonomists to supplement data from anatomy and answer questions like these. Scientists use DNA evidence when anatomical traits alone can't provide clear answers. Giant pandas and red pandas, for example, share anatomical similarities with both bears and raccoons, and both of them have peculiar wrist bones that work like a human thumb. Let's look at the cladogram. What happened to the red panda? It's actually placed in a different clade than the giant panda. Even though they share some similar characteristics and live in fairly similar habitats, we can see that the red panda is actually in a different clade that branched off back here. The giant panda is fairly closely related to a bear. The red panda is more closely related to the raccoon. This different clade also includes other organisms, such as seals and weasels. DNA analysis revealed that the giant panda shares a more recent common ancestor with bears than with raccoons, whereas the red panda shares a more recent common ancestor with raccoons than with bears. The modern evolutionary classification system is a rapidly changing science with a difficult goal: to present all life on a single evolutionary tree. As new discoveries are made, biologists regularly change the way organisms are grouped and sometimes change the names of groups. Understand that cladograms are visual presentations of hypotheses about relationships. They are not hard and fast facts. They're hypotheses, not theories. Let's look at this image. This tree of life shows current hypotheses regarding evolutionary relationships among the taxa within the 3 domains of life. Remember the 3-domain system of classification that divides all life into bacteria or eubacteria, archaea or archaebacteria, and eukarya or eukaryotes. So bacteria, archaea, and eukarya are the 3 domains of life. Understand that the blue, purple, and peach shading represents the domains, while the actual color of the lines on the cladogram show which kingdom each lineage of organisms belongs to. How can you tell by looking at the cladogram that each of the domains is its own clade? Well, all of the organisms in each domain share a common ancestor. If we snipped off this lineage above, if we snipped off the cladogram above this node, we would get the bacteria. If we snipped it off above this node, we would get archaea. And if we snipped it off above this node, we would get eukarya. Understand that while the 3 domains each represent a clade, only 5 of the 6 kingdoms are clades. Members of the kingdom Protista belong to different clades and are thus not considered by biologists to be a true group. Despite this anomaly, the 6 kingdoms are often still used to group organisms, and students are likely to encounter the term kingdom Protista in your studies. Notice how the Protista are actually split into different clades. Understand the difference between classifying organisms by kingdoms and by clades, and how this class in the textbook we use will often use quotation marks around Protista to show that it is not a group in cladistic classification. We can see that the domain eukarya is actually divided into these 4 kingdoms. Here's Animalia, all of these red branches. We could snip this off here and find that all animals came from a common ancestor. They make a clade. Plantae are here. We could snip the cladogram here above this node and see that all Plantae are related to each other. They make a clade. And then if we snipped off fungi above this node, they would also make a clade, one common ancestor and all of its descendants. Notice, however, there's nowhere that you could snip So the Protista are the yellow branches. There's nowhere you could snip and get just yellow branches, because Protista are not a true kingdom. Some protists have characteristics of plants, some have characteristics of fungi, and some have characteristics of animals, and they cannot be traced back to one common ancestor. So scientists are still challenged to classify Protista. Members of the domain bacteria are unicellular and prokaryotic. Unicellular means that each organism is only one cell. Prokaryotic means that those cells, a prokaryotic cell does not have a nucleus in it, and it does not have other organelles like chloroplasts, mitochondria. Prokaryotic DNA is structured differently than eukaryotic DNA. Prokaryotes they're bacteria, and they're simpler, much more ancient, much more primitive organisms than eukaryotes. Although, I guess that's not fair to say they're more primitive, because even though they existed long before eukaryotes, they have also continued to evolve throughout Earth's history. Bacteria cells have thick, rigid walls that surround the cell membrane. The cell walls contain a substance known as peptidoglycan. These bacteria are ecologically diverse, ranging from free-living soil organisms to deadly parasites. Some photosynthesize, while others do not. Some need oxygen to survive, while others are killed by oxygen. This domain corresponds to the kingdom Eubacteria. The image shown is a type of bacterium called Lactobacillus acidophilus. This image shows an Archaebacterium. Members of the domain Archaea also are unicellular. They're also prokaryotic. Many of them live in some of the most extreme environments that you can imagine. They live in volcanic hot springs that get incredibly hot, brine pools that have super high salt content, and black organic mud totally devoid of oxygen. Indeed, many of these bacteria can survive only in the absence of oxygen. Their cell walls lack peptidoglycan, and their cell membranes contain unusual lipids that are not found in any other organism. The domain Archaea corresponds to the kingdom Archaebacteria. The image shown is of Halobacterium mediterranea. The domain Eukarya consists of all organisms that have a nucleus. It comprises the 4 remaining major groups of the 6-kingdom system: Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. The protists are unicellular eukaryotes. Each group of the eukaryotes, formerly known as protists, is separate, and each shares closest common ancestors with other groups rather than with each other. Most are unicellular, but one group, the brown algae, is multicellular. Some are photosynthetic, while others are heterotrophic. Some display characters that most closely resemble those of plants, fungi, or animals. The image shown here is of Euglena. Why is Kingdom Protista not valid under evolutionary classification? Members of the Kingdom Protista fall into at least 5 clades, that are not more closely related to each other than they are to other groups. In other words, they do not form a monophyletic clade, and only monophyletic groups are valid under evolutionary classification. This is a fungus. Members of the kingdom fungi are heterotrophs with cell walls containing a substance called chitin. Most feed on dead or decaying organic matter. Unlike other heterotrophs, fungi secrete digestive enzymes into their food source. After the digestive enzymes have broken down the food into smaller molecules, the fungi absorb the small molecules into their bodies. Mushrooms and other recognizable fungi are multicellular. Some fungi, yeasts for example, are unicellular. This image is of a mushroom. Remember, mushrooms are not plants. They are not part of the same clade. That fungi is a completely different, and even under Linnaean classification, fungi is a completely different kingdom than Plantae. Members of the kingdom Plantae are autotrophs with cell walls that contain cellulose. Autotrophic plants are able to carry on photosynthesis using chlorophyll. Plants are non-motile. They cannot move from place to place. In this class and in our textbook that we use, we follow the lead of the most current cladistic analysis, making the entire plant kingdom a sister group to the red algae, traditionally classified as protists. The plant kingdom includes the green algae, along with mosses, ferns, cone-bearing plants, and flowering plants. Members of the kingdom Animalia are multicellular and heterotrophic. Animal cells do not have cell walls at all. Most animals can move about, at least for part of their life cycle. There is incredible diversity within the animal kingdom, and many species of animals exist in nearly every part of the planet.